The next presentation will be by Professor Yrjö Niemets. He's from the Estonian University of Life Sciences, Institute of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. He serves as an editor for several scientific journals and has published in many top journals. One of his current projects concentrates on plant emissions by biotic and abiotic stresses and consequences for community ecology. And today he will talk under the title Abiotic and Biotic Stresses in Forests Under Climate Change. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to give this presentation. It's also like really especially nice because we have used a lot of we are using in this way a lot of ideas from Finnish scholars, in particular from Martin, and we are trying also to clone the SMES station with stories. It's basically we are learning a lot in these days. Yeah, that's good. Well, just to give you an idea, what is our general idea of our research agenda is that we are trying to understand what determines the distribution of vegetation in Earth. And this actually really, from a broad perspective, we are not only focusing on vegetation in Estonia, which Estonia is so small that it's normally only one pixel in the global model with the whole. So we try to really understand the distribution of vegetation ecosystem from forest to deserts. And I personally have been conducting research from Arctic to tropics and different ecosystems. And really amazing how plants are growing in these different ecosystems. And what is really key in understanding plant growth is how plants acclimate to different stress factors. This is what we are trying to understand, and what are the stresses and how plants can acclimate to these stresses. And today I wanted to give you just a basic overview. What is stress? How stress is changing on the planet, what kind of new combinations we can expect, and what can be the large-scale stress effects and the implications for the planet and climate change. When we look for stress, and stress is basically any factor that is changing the rate of plant-specific processes like photosynthesis. In the case of photosynthesis, actually it seems quite simple. We need the energy comes from light, and we need also food for plants, which is CO2. Then plants are reducing this CO2 as the level of sugars and lipids, all organic compounds. And also, of course, plants need water, and plants need nutrients, and then plants give us oxygen, and oxygen comes from water, by the way. When plants are starting to experience stress, normally it's the rate of this kind of process, like say photosynthesis growth, is going on at a certain steady state level with some fluctuations. When plant is experiencing stress, and the process rate is decreasing, and this decrease is called stress response. So this is basically what plant ecophysiology is doing in these days, trying to understand how plants are responding to stress, how much they respond, and what are the consequences. And from a forestry perspective, if plant is having stress, and the growth rate is reduced. And this is what we see very, very well in growth rates. Growth rates are not equal, so they are changing here, and this is, reflects the response of trees to stress. In the case of plant responses to environmental or abiotic stresses, these responses normally are responses with an optimum. So it's like a classical bell-shaped response curve. There is a certain optimum when the response is at maximum level. And then when the temperature is decreasing, for instance, in the case of photosynthesis response to temperature, the plant is having heating stress, and when temperature is rising above the optimum, then the plant is having heat stress. And both are actually reducing plant function. In the case of biotic stresses, the responses are different. because it's actually there is no that sort of optimum. Actually, biotic interactions normally always constitute a negative response for the plant. But here's an example of Pandora moth in the United States is a very bad pest, or rather Pandora responses to herbivore, very strong herbivore defoliator, and you see it's like really large areas can be defoliated. And what you see also like in terms of chronology is this kind of really reduction in growth rate. You see these rings are very, very small compared with the rings before the insect attack and after the insect attack. And there has been nice studies, yes, in the paper in ecology where there is an evidence of more than 600 years of these attacks by Pandora moth in U.S. conifer forest, and you see all this kind of, every now and then this specific insect outbreaks occur, and these have major effects on forest growth. But this is no optimum. This is basically, even if you have one single insect, it's already reduces the plant growth. Of course, in the case of big tree, one insect doesn't matter, but if you have tens and hundreds and thousands and millions of insects in an ecosystem, then the problem is very big. Another concept in stress biology, a very important concept are acclimations and acclimation and tolerance. In the case of acclimation, this is a recovery of plant functional activity during stress. What it means, we have stress that the plant process rate is reducing, and then over weeks or months the process rate is recovering, and this is called acclimation. So that's very important actually, that biological systems can acclimate under stress and recover. In the case of temperature, actually, we are like having this temperature response curve, and in global models, actually, this is very bad science, by the way. It's actually published in the mainstream journal of Nature and Science, and every now and then. It's actually also good for journalists. They're taking some message. So one message was in 90s that Amazon would become desert. And this response was predicted according to this shape, because it's getting warmer, photosynthesis goes down, and it ends up with big problems and so on. But then there was this prediction, and this was actually widespread in public news media. And the prediction was that by year 2010 it will be desert. And we are in 2010 and there is no desert. It was completely wrong. And the problem really is that, in these global models, people, even all global models in these days, are using this one single response curve for Arctic and for tropics and for everything. And maybe in some models it's different for different plant functional types, but this is very, very few models that are using it different. But in reality, what happens? We have, like, say for Arctic, we have one temperature response curve and the temperature is rising, but we have the shape of the temperature response curve is shifting. This we know very well from plant results, and this is called acclimation. And the plants have very strong capacity to acclimate. This is also a question what happens in global change. If we use this fixed response curve, and this is what the people are doing, then all the predictions are actually like really very weak. And without acclimation in global models, we really cannot say much. But I think this is actually all models do not included, and most models do not included are completely off in understanding what will happen in response to global change. So really, this is a very important aspect of understanding how plants respond. Then the other issue is tolerance, and tolerance is already the genetic plant capacity to resist stress. Then we have again this process rate, and then there is stress, and plant functional activity is reduced. Then this is for species 1, and then we have species number 2, which is responding different and is more tolerant to this particular stress. So this is called tolerance, the plant capacity to resist stress. As some examples here, for instance, the picture is quite funny. But what you see here, some plants are there under drought and some plant species are not. So at the ecosystem scale, you always see that stress is favoring some species, and in terms of competitive world, some species will win as them. And the non-stress conditions, other ones are very positive. As an example, this kind of tolerance, this concept comes from is in forestry already, like Julius Wiener in early 19th. essentially was using this concept of shade tolerance in forest. And like if you take two boreal species, Scots pine and Norway spruce, and we know actually already based on experience that the Scots pine are forming relatively low density stands, and the pine and the spruce forests are much denser. And there is shade tolerance. Now it's a 5-scale ranking, like in classical forestry sciences. 5 is the most shade tolerant, 1 is the least shade tolerant. In the case of Scots pine is quite intolerant, that means the others is quite tolerant. So the most tolerant is commonly in forestry is like peach, like late successional species is 5, and well, I don't know, you know, this 1.7, that's like tunica, maybe like growing in really open places. On the other hand, we can also think about the same things with frost resistance. Here is the Juniperus communis, -60. Is actually quite tolerant. Some of the boreal trees have frost tolerance of even less than -100 degrees, which is like awkward. You never have it -100, but you know, this is a potential tolerance. Or even you can put some liquid nitrogen and warm up and they're still alive. So it's like really incredible tolerance in deep tones. And here's Juniperus genetic, which is Chinese juniper, which is sold in all supermarkets actually in Estonia and in Finland, by the way. You can buy it and put in your garden. It comes from the Netherlands actually. It's in big garden stores. And it's good actually because it keeps the global economy growing, because every year or every other year you need to replace it because it's just not surviving over winter. But you can buy it. It's like that. Well, anyway, it's -35. Then if we look at different stress factors, you see there are many biotic stresses, abiotic stresses, and here we have diseases, herbivore competition. In the case of abiotic stresses, we have temperature, water, and then it can be too hot, too cold, water logging, and so on. So there is a lot of stresses. Basically, every factor can be constitute stress for the plant. If you look at that, like a characteristic bog ecosystem in Australia, what we have said is there are many different abiotic stresses occurring simultaneously. And here we have water stress. It's normally there is too much water, but also because the root systems are in very thin layers, maybe only like 10-15 centimeters soil layer. And it's also, this can dry out with water table 6 in summer. And it can be also major drought stress. We have measured that it is really incredible drought stress in these amounts, which is unbelievable, but that's it. It's quite significant drought stress under some conditions. Nutrient limitations, really low in nutrients, very low in phosphorus and nitrogen. Excess light, when there is not much shading and not much nutrient photosynthetic capacity is low, so overall it's a strong photoinhibition in these ecosystems. Also, there can be mechanical stress due to strong winds. This open community, wind speeds tend to be high. Surface movement due to frost during winter and so on. In the case of forest, what we have is normally, here's pine forest, but normally it's also low light is the problem. We have in the forest floor is maybe 1 to 5% light only. Water limitations under some conditions, nutrient limitations. And a bunch of other stresses, like mechanical stress in the trees, and that's the top of the canopy, and so on. And then if we put these things together, we start comparing the stress situation in different communities. You see that actually having multiple stresses simultaneously is very common. It's something that we don't think very often. That you know, normal is not only single limitation. It's not like nitrogen is limiting or is light is limiting, but there is normally there are several different stresses occurring. And this is a key thing to understand how plants are responding to these multiple stresses. That's very important. Well, if we further try to generalize, we take 3 factors, temperature, light, and water. And on the basis of these 3 factors, we can describe almost the distribution of all ecosystems in the Earth. Of course, we also need to add the seasonal frost to explain where is the tropical forest and the system where there is never has been frost. But overall, with these 3 factors, we can make a good job in really separating the world scale ecosystem. In the case of multiple stresses, the tolerance to more than one stress is very rare. We have made an investigation across the northern hemisphere of all these species. We had altogether more than 800 species across the northern hemisphere, from three, and we separated these among three continents. And that's quite noisy. This is ecology. This is something like if you start looking at ecological patterns and things are noisy because plants are really having a specific characteristic suits or traits. But what's overall take-home message here is that shade tolerance and drought tolerance, the y-axis is shade tolerance, they are negatively correlated. So it's basically the plants cannot simultaneously be drought tolerant and shade tolerant. So it's like if we think about also like in the context of spruce and pines, and pine is normally more drought tolerant than spruce. And then the difference with shade tolerance. So there are these inherent trade-offs in ecological potential. Well, if we look at now global change, then that's the same time. This is a nice one, actually. Though CO2 concentration is increasing, what I want to emphasize here is that if we look at the photosynthetic response of photosynthesis to CO2 concentration, and this one is increasing. So we are here. And this is actually a very strong increase according to this curve. And in fact, actually also there is IPCC, but there is also other people having websites and stuff and saying that this is good. That's very good because CO2 is rising and this gives a lot of benefits for the society, for the plants, and why should we stop it? So that's actually like some people really do believe in it. But this is something which is, well, just based on the CO2 response curve of photosynthesis. But of course, if we have CO2 rising, we have also most likely increases in temperature, and this constitutes another problem because temperature can be a severe stress factor for the plants. And then if we have combined factors, we have rising temperature and rising CO2, and at the end, the increase in photosynthesis is of course much less. Except if we consider adaptation. Adaptation is a key thing also. But overall, this is what IPCC different scenarios are predicting. The take-home message from here, like in 100 years perspective, is getting warmer, especially in the northern latitudes. So it's getting quite a bit warmer. And but different scenarios, there are three different scenarios. So depending on scenarios, 2 to 7 degrees increase in annual temperature. So let's see also another stress factor is humidity, and these scenarios also predict that overall in the North Atlantic it's getting more humid. And now there is a question also what it does mean for performance of vegetation. And there are several papers trying to discuss the experience and say there are actually like no appliances. And there has been no analog communities in the past, and it's very difficult to say based on what we know on the vegetation performance in the past. In fact, actually, if we look about the stress interactions, they are not really novel in a way, but this is actually what is novel is the severity of combinations of different stresses. So stress severity can be different, and this generates this kind of novel issues there. And here, for instance, in the United States, like four states in New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona, like what happened with tree growth in response to nature drought, and there were two papers that we announced because they said, well, in the future it will be a huge problem because of this combined global change type of drought with warming. And this was so nice, and then overall the point is that there will be no combinations of severity or duration of different stresses. And then quite recently, actually, Swiss colleagues were not very happy about these papers and saying that this is actually bad science because it's based on a very few seedlings and it's very, very difficult to make this extrapolation, which actually emphasizes points that it's very important to do long-term measurements and then really be more careful with these sort of things. It's most likely that actually the original message in these papers is correct, but it's actually like in terms of scientific evidence is somewhat weak in this state. But if we look at our countries, northern latitudes, and what we have here is actually quite wet. So it's like if we combine this getting warmer and having plenty of water, then plus the expectations, as is rough expectation from plant physiologists could be that it's actually opportunity. It's getting plants are going to grow faster. But what we observe also, there is another set of novel problems. And here's the beaver. And the beavers can generate a lot of problems actually. And, just to put this in perspective in quantitative way, in Estonia, the population size of beavers in 1985 was 25. Was protected animal. Was very, you almost didn't see big beavers. And now the population size is 18,000. And when all suitable habitats were filled, its population size that Estonia could support is 200,000 beavers. So it's actually a lot, and these animals are generating a lot of problems with water logging for forest. It's something like, basically what it means that in the case of water logging, long roots are not getting oxygen, and this is very inefficient situation. In the case of oxygen, plants are getting from 1 mole glucose, 36 mole ATP, and in the case of water logging, it's just 2 moles. So it is 18 times less efficient. And over long term, no plant species can really survive under complete water logging without oxygen. So there are different adaptations like iron armor formation and things like that. Like plants that cannot adapt to this system are really dying. And this is what you see in many places in Estonia. It's like this decline in forest time due to water logging resulting from activity of beavers. So it's actually like interesting aspect, and then also underscores the importance to also consider the biotic interactions in this system. Another important player in global change has been postulated is the increased occurrence of biotic attacks. So it is information that was data suggesting that this mountain pocket, Pedroctonus ponderosa, is really having a capacity to change the carbon sink of this forest. And indeed, in the case of mild outbreak, like maybe some branches are there, but then like in more massive attack, several trees, and then at the landscape level, you see this kind of areas which are brownish here, large here. This is all actually trees that are dying, and you can see this also from satellite images, really large areas. This is already like distance of 1 degree to 1 degree. So it's actually like really large areas can decline due to the speed of attacks. And of course also when you have a lot of dry wood in the forest due to declining forest as a result of beetle attacks, and this is also making this system more vulnerable to fire. So this is also one thing that is expected in the future is more occurrence of wildfire. And on the other hand, also the foliators activity has been suggested to increase in future ecosystems due to changes in leaf composition. And another example is that these leaves are, here's a toxic plant, and it's suggested that those plants are not only the concentration of the toxic compounds is higher, but also is more allergenic for humans. This is also changing the competitive relation because this toxic compound is also toxic to insects, and this having increased concentration in these compounds is selectively favors dispersal of this particular species. This is something I must apologize. I was showing some of those slides also yesterday in students' conference, and this is when I was reading to students about I started to think about this overall, this biotic interactions, and I prepared these slides. And here's Ips tuberculosis, which is a spruce bark beetle with a very bad forest pest in Nordic countries. And if you actually with temperatures rising and the population size of these insects is rising, it's probably true. It's actually benefiting to these insects. They can have several the life cycle, several populations during the year. On the other hand, most likely also the population size of natural animals is increasing. And what are these natural animals? Is like woodpeckers, carnivorous insects, and here is also parasitic wasps. So these are increasing, and overall this is most likely leading to a negative feedback loop in this system. And in reality, it's very difficult to predict what happens on the global chain. So whether really these insect outbreaks will be more frequent, or whether they will be not, this is something we don't know. There is really not much evidence. It's only based on basically looking in the past. And right now it's very hard to say much about it. And on the other hand, if we have higher humidity, this is leading to greater frequency of all different kinds of pathogens. But pathogen of these heavy ones. What can be these pathogens? Viruses, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, protozoa, and this again can suppress population size of those insects. Here is some examples. So there's not much data really in primary literature, just finding a few, which is quite amazing what is there under the bark. You can see all nematodes and pathogenic bacteria and so on. And this is working in favor of us actually. This is killing the herbivores. And again, here's another study with another bark, spruce bark beetle. So this is basically there is a really very active set of biological interactions that are going on that really need further study to say in conclusive manner that in the future we will have more problems due to biotic attacks. It's very difficult to say. Then another issue is what about the changes in stress resistance? And I made a very simple conceptual model of how stress is affecting the plants. When the plant is assimilating under optimal conditions, if everything is happy, there is a newly assimilated carbon, some are going to storage carbon, there is no structural carbon, these two pools together, and when the plant is happy, so biosynthesis is high. And when the plant is experiencing stress, severe stress, these carbon pools all are declining, and at the end the plant cannot survive over a long term under severe stress. So this is actually like really what's happening. All carbon pools are depleted, and the plant is finally dead. But then, let's look at the situation in the case of elevated CO2. What we have there is that, first of all, the pools are much bigger. This is all research that has been done on elevated CO2 shows is that always non-structural carbon pools are much bigger in the case of elevated CO2. And this is very important because if photosynthesis is declining, and it's declining also less because remember, we are in this curve, and we are anyway doing better. When CO2 is dropping, it's actually the effect will be much less. And then also the pools are changing less, and that's it. Always the expectation is that on the elevated CO2, the plants are more resistant to the different stresses. And in fact, there is evidence that really does demonstrate this, that elevated CO2 is improving plant stress resistance. And this resistance to heat, resistance to drought, perhaps also to pathogen attacks like fungi, because the plants can resist longer, and so on. Now if we look at the rise of CO2 concentration again, and we look at this response curve, another question I wanted to address here is actually how do different plant life forms respond. We have in boreal forest like spruce and pine, and these are conifers, and then we have birch, which is a broadly deciduous species. And pines are one of the deciduous species, of course. Here we have the rise, and we expect that this photosynthesis is improving. If we look at the responsiveness of CO2 to CO2 concentration, and this is actually the first derivative of photosynthesis with respect to CO2 concentration. So we have a CO2 response curve of photosynthesis, and then if we take the first derivative of this, the curve, the responsiveness looks like that, and here is the rise of CO2 concentration. And that's important actually, because what it shows here is that with increasing CO2 concentration, the responsiveness is changing actually. So, it's actually like, we say CO2 is benefiting us, but then beyond a certain level, there is no longer a benefit. And the question is actually when the point is reached, when CO2 is no longer improving the photosynthesis. In particular, for me, the question was, when this occurs for different life forms. And also, this is something what is not really always addressed. Is a case of when we are talking about CO2 response to photosynthesis, we must look into CO2 in chloroplast. Not as ambient CO2. Ambient CO2 doesn't actually really matter for photosynthesis. It's CO2 concentration inside the chloroplast, where photosynthesis goes on. And we can have 3 different CO2 response curve of photosynthesis. Here we have CO2 response curve of photosynthesis to ambient CO2. Then we have stomata. CO2 has to go to stomata. And then this is the curve when we have photosynthesis in response to CO2 concentration in the cellular air space. And this is normally used in all models right now in photosynthesis models, which are based on Barkov et al. Type photosynthesis model. So they are normally using this one. But the model itself is based on CC, which is CO2 concentration in chloroplast. But until recently it was not possible to measure it, and now it's measured in routine way in many labs. But you see, well, there is a certain drawdown associated with this. And then now the question is, what if we have leaves with different structure? Then this drawdown from intercellular air space to chloroplast, this can vary. And this is what we are actually suggesting on the basis of evidence. So far we have collected all the evidence of these drawdowns that have been measured, and this basically, this evidence predicts that if we have different scenarios, we have enhancement of photosynthesis 780 versus 390, and this is this white dot here, and this is already what has happened. And really we were stimulated by the evidence in the Mediterranean countries that evergreens are moving higher in altitudes, and those evergreens like ilex moving towards north in Europe, like in Denmark or Sweden. So it is actually suggests that the evergreens are benefiting from CO2 more than the cedar species. And people tend to think that this is a warming effect, but in fact it's also, it seems like really the CO2 itself is a very important driver of this movement. Well, if you look at the CO2 response curve again, we have the rise here, then in the case of evergreens, we're still here. So in fact, evergreens photosynthesis is changing much more with a given rise of CO2 concentration than in the case of the cedar species, where we are there. So this is something which is not really in any of the models so far, this effect. That in fact, like the cedar species are already start to saturate quite soon. And in the case of evergreens, we are still like in the phase where the CO2 is increasing cell productivity much more than in the case of the cedar species. Well, the other issue is like what is not really that much considered is if you start looking at the species ecological potentials and adaptation capacities. Say like these 3 key species like Norway Spruce, Scotch pine, and birches, they are really large range of dispersal. They are very, very plastic species, and let's take like a Norway Spruce. Somewhere in Lapland, in Sollingula, it's minus 0.8 annual temperature, something like that. And it also grows in Germany, in Mittelgebirge, where the annual temperature is 8.7 degrees or about 9 degrees. And in fact, if we just, like say, okay, the temperature in Sollingula will be 5 degrees higher, or in southern Finland, you know, it's actually like in the case of spruce, like as a species, as a general, the species is not like, you know, you think, oh, okay, it's a spruce there in Sollingula, spruce is the same spruce in Mittelgebirge. It is of course not, they are genetically different, but as a species itself, it has its acclimation potential. We have been studying the genetic variability of Scotch pine, and this is very surprising, but there is not much data about genetic variability about this important species. And we have made it really ranging from Turkey to South Sweden and Estonia. And it's more than 2,500 kilometers distance. And the take-home message, and we were really surprised, was that actually, you know, this analysis is also based on here is chloroplastic markers and here is nuclear microsatellite markers. What you see here is, especially like if you look at nuclear markers, among population variability is very small. It's just 3% variability across this 2,500 kilometers crater. and here is 20% for chloroplastics markers in more. But within population, within a single site, we have like in Estonia, we have sampled hundreds of trees, and the two trees growing next to each other, the variability is much bigger than amongst the two trees growing in Estonia and Turkey. So within the same population, you have actually huge variability. This is the basis for adaptation to global change. That's actually like very, very important that you have actually this capacity to acclimate. Here's another evidence of what it means. Also, we have genetic variability. This is just genetics, but here we also see this very fine scale variability, chemotype level variability, very big variability actually amongst the Estonian chemotypes of Scots Park. Really, like two trees next to each other, very different. And here's also example what it means is that here what we can distinguish is like low free carrine pines and high free carrine pines. And there is evidence actually that high free carrine pines are more resistant to bug beetle attacks. So it is something which is really important. Like if you have this insect complex, some trees are preferably living and some are dying, and we have this kind of responses to all different drivers. Here in Finland, there is a lot of nice research has been conducted on understanding the phenology of trees in different environments. And here's an example of the adaptation of this kind of effective. Here's effective temperature sun at first, and you see that the northern latitude is much less, and at lower latitudes. And this is also, again, if we have global change, actually within the species, there is already the potential to acclimate to these changes, with changing in genotype frequency and so on. And of course, there is also potential for other species, like oaks, which are right now maybe not that important in Finland, and also in Estonia, somehow it's all blue, like it looks like oak, but oak is actually not doing very well in Estonia at all. So from forestry perspective, it's very bad oak, so I wouldn't recommend it to grow oak in Estonia these days, but maybe in the future actually. So it's there is a lot of opportunities also with global change. And here, maybe even you can consider beech has been 100 years back. Now in Sweden is an important species, and as we know also during Atlantic climate in Estonia and Finland. So maybe in the future, it's just to keep in mind. But this is a very big but actually with all those arguments. Actually, what I said, that species can acclimate and so on. So the crucial question is how fast is temperature rising? And different scenarios are predicting different speed of temperature rise. And basically, the full argument is here that the rise of temperature has never been that fast in the past. So this is a very important point actually. But what is behind all the scenarios of global change is how fast is temperature rising. And this is something we actually, it's very, the only evidence we have in the past is basically tree rings, and this tree ring study has been criticized a lot, and some studies say, no, actually, in medieval times also temperature rise was very fast, and did not constitute the problem. So that is a big controversy with arguments here. Another problem, actually, if we are talking about managed forests, is that the human influence on these ecosystems and the genotype frequency is huge. Actually. So this is actually also, if we have impoverished gene pools, which occurs in managed forests, and then the responses of the trees can be actually much more adversely affected by climate change. In science, it's actually very common to use this nice map, which is potential natural vegetation. And it looks like, all Europe is covered with forests, and there are all different types of forests. And it's all a nice scheme, but then in reality, the thing is that it's nothing like that. Only in Scandinavia, we have maybe the potential natural vegetation, more or less, and so it's also managed forests in many places. But overall, this scheme is quite nonsense actually to understand what ecosystems are doing. In reality, we are there in this day. Now let's get to the final point. Why is it? What are the important effects of this stress and stress acclimation, and what are the implications for climate? Every stress leads to a cascade events at cellular level, and this basically starts with oxidative signaling, and there is signals going on with nucleus, and there is hormonal interactions before that. The picture can be quite complex, and then finally there is this kind of stress responses, and stress responses can be acclimation, or it can be programmed self-death. So it's exactly like there are two options for the plant. They're either surviving or dying. But during this process, there is a bunch of components is being emitted from the plants, which are stress signaling components, and there are also components that are formed in response to stress later when gene expression goes on, and there are like these characteristic components that are emitted from plant static components, that the way the fatty acids going through the cascade, and there is like, it's very sensitive, very quickly emitted. Different C6 aldehydes, which is called green leaf volatiles, or a smell of green grass. When you touch the glass, you smell it. Yeah, always said. And there is a bunch of these volatiles being formed, and there is more than 20,000 different compounds. And it's important because worldwide, those compounds that coming from plants are actually like much bigger than the contribution that comes from anthropogenic sources. And these compounds have the capacity to form ozone and reactive oxygen species, and then they form secondary organic aerosols and blood condensation nuclei. And I can actually go quickly here because Marco has made a really nice introduction and the information of what the effects can be. So you see these large-scale effects, visual effects that they can. The forests really are important in the formation of these aerosols and blood condensation nuclei, and really the effects are that important that you can really state that if you start cleaning the air, you need obviously, most of this research on these compounds has been carried out with constitutive emitters. And here some conifers, you see, it's like resin ducts, and they are emitting monotropics. And then there are some broad species that are emitting that don't have the storage structures. We now find a bit of this in constitutive emissions. There's two recent reviews about the subject, and there is a book that is coming out in May. And then I would say that in this book there is actually like a milestone in this business with constitutive emissions. It's a book chapter by Marco and colleagues, and this is the first time quantitative test of this feedback loop, which is very significant. It's actually, as you see here, it's CO2 is increasing primary production, this is increasing water emissions, increasing secondary organic aerosols, this leads to increased diffuse radiation, this is benefiting productivity. On the other hand, also water is increasing in response to temperature, but then they also contribute to cloud condensation, nuclear formation, and this is actually cooling down. So this is a negative feedback loop. And this book chart actually, this was first time really quantitatively tested based on visual data. This is a very nice test. But in this test there is no induced emissions, and I will quickly show a few slides about the induced emission. You see it's actually like Novus non-constitutive emission. You see it's very small, and then you have spider-mite infested, and you see huge emissions coming from Novus spruce. And here's another one with the moth species in Alder. You see it's all this kind of emission, almost zero, and then you go to huge emissions. Here's another one with rust fungus emissions. And actually, this solids is considered isotope emission, constitutive emission go down, and then you have monotherapy, sesquiterapy, and this green leaf water. And here is the heat stress, and tomato, frost stress, drought stress. Here is the flooding stress. You see again the emissions go up in different species. And here is in West, at large scale chamber measurements in maples, that is non-constitutive emission from forests of the United States. It also shows this induced emissions here. These are example of measurements in Scots Pine in Finland that actually, like under normal circumstances, monoterpene emitter, but then suddenly it becomes a sesquiterpene emitter. This was associated with the fungal spore concentration in the air, so it's actually again suggesting induced emissions. Then here we made a little analysis of emission factor of Venus Pinea. And you see it's the low level and dominated by laminine, and this is like induced emission, which is like much bigger actually for this species. And here's another one actually from Finnish team, and this data has never been actually looked from this angle. But I think actually, like if you look at here, monotherapy, sesquiterpene, this looks like a mess actually. you cannot explain it very well. It goes up in some years it's nothing. And I think exactly what you see here is also under normal circumstances. This is like constitutive emission. Like when we measure birds, we don't see a fig normally. But then this is actually like basically induced emission. It's much bigger. And take home message, and then finally to sum up is like, here we have a spruce which is constitutive plus induced emission, here is constitutive plus induced, and this is induced emission under normal circumstances. And what is predicted for Finland is that like in South Finland, this birch is increasing a lot, and overall also full Finland is increasing. And then on the global change, what we have is overall emissions increase, but also the importance of induced emissions is increasing. That's exactly like a very important thing, which is missed actually so far, but which is not in these models. But I think that needs to be included, and it clearly requires much more research to look into this thing. And then we have this loop, and I think that we should put also the induced emissions in this loop and see how the loop works in the world when we have warmer and we have probably more induced emissions and how these things are going. So, yes.
Thank you very much. Quick question, comment, complaint? Yes.
For different kind of pest insects, and according to my knowledge, there's not so much help of those viral agents, because, for example, the growth rate of pest insects is much higher than those pests or pathogens, and therefore we need to have some kind of controlling methods, for example, combine forest management planning, and also studies on pest insects, pest outbreaks, and climate change, and also those volatiles and emissions. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with you that it's going to be important to really in the integrated manner. It's only I was throwing into this, as you correctly noted, for discussion, open up discussion. And something, if you look at like Nova spruce in Finland, and then you have Nova spruce forest in Germany, where it's like 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees warmer, and you don't see this kind of major problem with insects there. So apparently, like there is this ecosystem level controls that are finally like also quite important. And of course, you know, at some stage you bring the ecosystem over balance, and of course, if you kill all the trees, it's a problem. But there should be also this kind of feedback. So it would be important.
Okay, thank you. I suggest that we break for